Hello and welcome to Policy and Politics with me, Tarun Nangia. Now we will discuss the part 3 of J. Sai Deepak's book, India, that is Bharat, as you can see. As the book says, Coloniality, Civilization and Constitution. You've already seen the first 2 parts and J. Sai Deepak is kind enough to join us for part 3. Welcome, Sai, for joining us.
Thank you, Tarun.
Now, in fact, as I was reading your book and my interest into the subject is already there, I chanced upon an interview of V.S. Naipaul that he gave in the early 90s period. And he spoke about his visits to the temples of the South. And he said that gave me an impression of a very wounded civilization. And the scars are very deep. And today, whatever crimes that were committed on the Indic communities, if you see a pushback today, it is only that they are regaining what they had lost, or they are asserting their own Indic identity. Of course, he didn't use these terms. I'm using them, but just to convey what he meant. Would you, in a way, also agree with that?
I would certainly agree with the spirit of his observation, but there are 2 parts to it. Firstly, Sri Naipaul's visits were largely around Karnataka, and therefore his sense of wound specifically comes from the Hampi ruins,
yes,
which is obviously the consequence of 5 Islamic armies ganging up together against one Hindu kingdom, which is the Vijayanagar Empire, in the Battle of Talikota in 1565. In fact, Tipu Sultan's grandfather participated in this particular battle against the Vijayanagar Empire, from whatever I recollect. So obviously, this is what his opinion or his experience is informed by. Had he gone to certain other parts of the South, for instance, say the Madurai Meenakshi temple or the Tirupati temple, so to speak, I'm not sure how he would have responded to it, because it also clearly shows that while it has wounded, it has also survived significantly, and there are places which still continue to flourish. So that's important for us to understand, because otherwise it gives the impression that it's a defeated and therefore a defeatist society, which is not the case. Now, I certainly agree with the position that he's taken, that the reassertion of the dharmic identity is a response to the aggressions of both the Islamic colonizers as well as the Christian colonizers. And therefore, this, according to me, is best captured in his book, A Million Mutinies, or what he calls A Million Mutinies. Okay. So, which is why when someone looks at Hindutva and crudely dubs it as Hindu nationalism and compares it with European-style nationalism, I believe that they're making the mistake of imposing the framework of the colonizer on the response of the victim of colonization, as opposed to understanding that this is nothing but an attempt on the part of indigenous communities to reclaim their spaces, reclaim their culture, reclaim their past and their heritage, without the shame that is constantly foisted on them, without the sense of loathing and self-loathing that is constantly expected of them. So yes, I understand that particular spirit, and I think had he been alive in the 2020s, from 2019 or at least 2014 onwards, he'd have actually seen this as a resurgent civilization as opposed to a wounded civilization. So I certainly agree with it. And I think he was among the earliest champions of this particular reclamation. And if you recall, I think he was fairly even unapologetic about the events of 6th of December 1992.
Yeah, he made a comment to that point that, and in that very same interview, that if some act has been done with an intent to humiliate a certain feeling, then will ensure that there will be some kind of a pushback.
Correct.
Because the community, these are memories that are inherited through generations.
Correct.
Such things are never forgotten. And he Correct. Said it in that interview that he gave in the early 90s. Right. And of course, you were right. He spoke about his visit to the Belur ruins and the temple also there. And then he spoke. But moving ahead, on page 29 of your book, India, that is Bharat, you speak of that the modern school believes that Columbus' voyage was and must be seen as a glorious and heroic achievement that marked the beginning of the Christian West's destiny to liberate the non-Christian indigenous societies from their wretched existence.
Right.
Now, very curiously, the last two words talk of wretched existence.
Right.
So, was it a preconceived notion that everybody else is living a wretched life and they have to be somehow liberated from their misery?
Yes. So I think this is significantly informed by their Christian belief, where they believe that those who do not subscribe to the Christian faith necessarily live in a world of darkness and a culture of darkness. And therefore, the white light of the gospel needs to be shone on them to pull them out of their darkness. So my existence and its wretchedness is taken for granted and assumed as an irrebuttable presumption, if I were to use legal parlance here, by the Christian colonizer, who therefore believes that he has the divine right, mandate, and obligation to pull me out of that particular darkness, namely my religion or my faith system. And the only way to do that is to invite me into his way of life. And the only way that can be done is through not just religious conversion, but a complete cultural conversion, wherein every aspect of my life will now have to mold itself in the European image. So therefore, this wretched existence is something that I don't believe in as a practitioner of a non-Christian faith. But the Christian colonizers certainly subscribed to that particular notion, and that informed his sense of benevolent tyranny and benevolent, let's say, overlordship on indigenous societies. See, if let's say someone approaches you with a sense of hatred, then he is clear that your existence is an abomination which needs to be wiped out root and branch. That is more or less how I would characterize the attitudes of the pre-Christian Islamic invaders of India. But as far as the Christian invaders or Christian colonizers themselves are concerned, it is a benevolent tyranny which believes that he has the duty to save us, and we have the right, or rather we have an equally onerous obligation to pay heed to his gospel and somehow sever our ties with our past so that all our souls can be saved. And therefore, this evangelical fervor has characterized their colonization project, not just in Bharat, but across the world. And this is something that several Western authors themselves have highlighted significantly so that they could underscore the conduct of their ancestors. Be it in the United Kingdom or the United States, on both sides of the Atlantic, there are quite a few people who have actually produced this literature. So you cannot sever the relationship between European colonization of the world and the Christian fervor behind the colonization project.
In fact, you go on to say on page 29 that decolonial school believes that Columbus' voyage marks the beginning of one of the most repressive, bloody, and racist genocidal chapters ever witnessed in human history.
Correct.
That led to extinction of several cultures and critically wreaked havoc on nature on an unprecedented scale. So you mean the colonial project as such was more impactful than the spread of Islam starting 700 CE?
I would certainly say so, because you see, the response to the sword of Islam was also drawing of multiple swords across the world, because when Europe itself was invaded by what they call the Moors, especially Andalusia, as the Arabs want to call it, and Spain, as they would want to call it, as Europeans would want to call it. They launched a campaign after 800 years of slavery and took back Spain. That happened in several parts of Europe. And that was more or less Bharat's own reaction as well, starting right from the beginning, not just in the 10th century, but even before that. So I certainly believe that as far as the Christian colonization project is concerned, its primary strength comes from institutionalizing its way of life as an aspiration for the rest of us to aspire to, and use the social ladder to somehow climb to the top. And the top effectively means a Western modern lifestyle. And since they don't want to use the word Western lifestyle anymore, they would call it the modern lifestyle. And therefore, my primary objection to the use of modernity consistently to define anything that's new, because modern effectively translates to Western, and no matter how much you try to dissociate modern from Western, the fact of the matter is the history of the last 500 years do not permit you to drive this so-called artificial wedge between modernity and Westernization. Both are the same. Modernity is a secularized form of Westernity and Westernization, and Westernization is a secularization of Christianization. So the actual intent is to actually convert your way of life to a European mold, which is significantly based on the Christian template. So they would want to remove the word Christian so that most of us do not see the Christian strings behind it. So reason becomes pure reason, truth becomes plain truth, and peace becomes plain peace. But if you look at their own internal correspondence, they speak of Christian truth, Christian reason, Christian rationality, Christian logic, Christian peace, Christian brotherhood, and Christian nation states. So everything is Christian. When they remove it, it becomes secular.
Now, very interestingly, on page 30, you say that instead of treating the European European position as the sole universal benchmark, decoloniality prefers to treat it as but one of the options or subjectivities within the global pool of thought. So
Right.
you are saying what is being foisted upon the whole world is just one option, and there
Correct.
are many other ways of living.
Correct.
Yeah, you can go.
So the standardization project, which goes hand in hand with evangelization, is to impose one particular culture's experience as the experience of the rest of the world, and in the process, take away our right to our own individual subjectivities and our own cultural agency. So whether you look at it from the standpoint of trade, economics, religion, culture, dressing, clothing, science, knowledge, whatever it is, standardization seems to be the mantra by which this creature called colonization and its successor westernization effectively operates. So while they keep calling for diversity because of their newfound guilt complex, because they are not in a position to reconcile their past with the present, and therefore there is a certain sense of pandering to the gallery where they constantly speak of diversity, the fact of the matter is, even in the name of diversity, they expect the rest of the world to follow it. Which is to say, if Western thought suddenly believes in autocracy, the rest of us are supposed to believe in autocracy. If suddenly they start believing in progressive and liberal values, the rest of us are expected to shift our positions and immediately follow suit. That means the rest of the world has no other option except to follow the West. And every trial and error process that the Western society goes through, all of us are supposed to follow it. And those who are not following the footsteps of the West and are not in sync with the West are effectively outdated, are anachronistic, they're conservative, traditional. So every stupidity of the West becomes the new fad, and all of us are supposed to follow it. That is exactly what I'm saying. That tomorrow they will go liberal, we are expected to go liberal. Day after tomorrow they'll go autocratic, we are expected to go autocratic. The day after they'll suddenly say democracy as a project has been fundamentally a failure, and then all of us will keep parroting the same nonsense. So the idea is to say that every twist and turn of history cannot be dictated and guided by the West, and all of us have the right to take different positions on every issue.
Now, you go ahead and speak of one more interesting point. You says that one of the reasons I believe that the Asian experience could impact the way colonialism, coloniality, and decoloniality are perceived is because while almost the entirety of the American and close to half of Africa have been converted to the religion, which is Christianity, which is the religion of the European colonizer, and about 40% to Islam. That is not case with the vast swathes of Asia. Now, can you please explain why this not happen in Asia? Why, if Africa got converted, America got converted to the Christian case, Africa went to Islam and Christianity, why Asia remains not only unconverted, but Indic religions have flourished here?
Right. So if you look at three major civilizations or three important societies as far as the Asian society is concerned, then you're looking at the Bharatiya society, you're looking at the Chinese society, and you're looking at the Japanese society. Okay.
Yes.
Japan has significantly been insulated from the rest of the developments because of its geographical positioning. And not just that, after they successfully repelled the Mongoloid invasions, they were also very, very careful about keeping the Christian missionary outside the shores of Japan, while they embraced the, let's say, the industrialization of the West. Okay. So they wanted to take certain aspects of the West, but did not allow the West to dictate the roots of Japan, or let's say the way of life of Japan. Okay, so they went through their own internal struggle, because if you see this movie, The Last Samurai, it's actually based on the Samurai Rebellion, where the samurais did not want Japan to open its doors to the West because they believed that the Western devil would come and change their way of life. Not exactly an inaccurate position, which is exactly what has happened with the rest of us. And China has managed to significantly cultivate a strategy of creating buffer zones, which protects the core geographical region of its society, which is where its civilization comes from, which is South East China. So the belly of China is where their culture comes from, which is what is surrounded by those river systems. So even today, the strategy is to create as many geographical buffers as possible, and which is what informs their expansionist policy to protect that core. Otherwise, India and China have historically never enjoyed a border. Our immediate neighbors were actually Tibet, not Japan for that matter. Okay, so Tibetan plateau and the Tibetan kingdom was so vast and so huge that if you were to take out that particular portion, you take out the Mongolian portion, then you're actually looking at a smaller China, not as big as the behemoth that it makes itself out to be today. So that is one of the reasons that China has managed to protect the core of its culture by also taking an active position against Christian missionaries. In stark contrast, India opened it up to a significant extent under the British colonizer and should have taken a stronger position against Christian missionaries' entry into this country. But you see, Sri Jawaharlal Nehru was actively advised and guided by one particular Christian missionary by the name Verrier Elwin, who would actually advise him on matters of access to the Northeast being provided to Christian missionaries. That's precisely why the Northeast is significantly Christian today, not because they converted out of, let's say, a sense of oppression or because they wanted to run out of Hinduism, but because these, let's say, the Nehru dispensation effectively gave access to Christian missionaries to the Northeast. But otherwise, to answer your question, each of these three societies have significantly had at least 5,000 to 6,000 years of history. And they've had such cultural depth and such spiritual depth and institutional strength to respond that apart from political strength as well as the military strength needed to respond, that these societies have displayed an astounding resilience to Christian expansionism as well as Islamic expansionism. So that's one of the reasons that you don't find a significant population of, let's say, Muslims in China, except for the Xinjiang province. Okay.
It's nice you point that out. That's why I want to know from you this. You see, China of late fiercely defending its Han identity,
right.
Fiercely defending it.
Correct.
But even then, earning the respect of adversaries and nations such as Pakistan or Middle East, nobody comments on the internal workings of China.
Correct.
But in India, people will comment on any stray incident globally.
Correct.
Why do you think this happens that in India, even a stray incident is commented on? And in China, large-scale actions, people act as if they don't know or it doesn't happen. Even prime ministers of some countries say, we don't know what's happening in China. They may know, but they act or feign ignorance and say, whatever China does, it's for the betterment of its own country.
So crudely speaking, I think the world's reactions to China could be basketed in three different categories. One is that they fawn because they need access to the Chinese market, or they want access to Chinese investment. The second is where they criticize China in the name of human rights because they want access to the Chinese civil society to create trouble within China. That's exactly what the West does. And that's how it uses Hong Kong as the launchpad for creating human rights issues within China. Three is, let's say, the Islamic world's own reactions. I haven't seen a single major Islamic country, whether it's Turkey, Pakistan, or Saudi Arabia, or Iran for that matter, comment on Chinese treatment of Muslims within that particular country because one, they either have a strategic alliance where they all have a common animus against the United States, okay, and therefore they prefer to keep their mouth shut. And second, China doesn't tolerate any kind of nonsense when it comes to its internal affairs, okay. But the very important factor is China is very, very clear that the world responds only to political might and economic might and military might. And this concept of soft power is but an ancillary to each of these primary requirements and cannot be treated as the primary requisite for some kind of respect on the global stage. Therefore, it doesn't give a hoot to the world opinion, ultimately, because it says, I will do whatever is necessary in my national interest. And I'm not going to be rattled by some nonsensical 800-word piece or 1,000-word piece by New York Times or Washington Post. It is India that suffers from the syndrome of "Ye dunya kya kahegi, char log kya kahenge." Okay, and as long as India operates under this particular belief that the world is somehow created, let's say the world is somehow going to respect India the moment it starts towing the line of New York Times. That's never going to happen. And India shouldn't be doing any of these things. So I think India needs to learn a few things from China while also protecting its own interests from Chinese expansionism and belligerence. Okay, there are quite a few things that you have to consider. I'm not saying, therefore, let's give up democracy and go the Chinese way. I'm not going to make that statement. I'm not going to make the statement that let's abuse people in this country and repress human rights the way China does. I'm not saying any of that. But China has managed to do something in terms of posing the first clear challenge to the West's dominance. Okay, and therefore it is established that Asia and Asian societies and Asian countries can equally do this. Okay, so that is something that is a matter of confidence for the rest of the societies to say, we too can do this. In fact, we have greater cultural depth, we have greater knowledge systems, we have a lot more history behind us, because both China and Japan have traditionally looked up to Bharat for spiritual and cultural guidance. We, according to them, are their shifus or their cultural gurus. So today, unfortunately, the master has to learn from the student. That has become the unfortunate reality. So I think that India needs to understand that the global relationship, or let's say your position on the global stage, is a question of balance of power, not on some misplaced notion of whether you're a good person or a bad person. Good and bad perhaps work on an individual scale, at a person-to-person scale, but when the scale of reference is global, then the optics are very different, the mechanics are very different, and the dynamics are very, very different. I don't think we should be applying the values of individual interpersonal relationships to interstate relations or global relations.
Okay. Now, on page 34, you say the active local resistance offered by the indigenous faith systems of Asia, in particular Bharat, to coloniality, and its underlying evangelical motivations makes the study of coloniality all the more relevant and critical to the existence and survival. Second, on page 36, 2 pages later, you say, coloniality was entrenched in the colonized societies through a political legal infrastructure of European colonizers, as well as education system introduced by them, which shaped the thinking of the native elites. Now, I have a question. You please explain this, but I also want to know, see, there has been a vacuum of many hundreds of years in which either the first invaders or the second colonizers have set up their systems. So would it be prudent that we accept that, okay, there was a glorious past, but there was nothing in between per se? And so to build something becomes all the more difficult because your reference point is something which has no relevance today. Would you agree that your reference point, institutions change over time and our reference points are very old?
No, I would disagree for a very good reason. Let's look at what is it that you are saying in terms of continuity. Okay. The fact of the matter is there was a continuity in terms of governance structures as well as education systems, even until 1947, because you see, if you take a look at the princely states of Travancore, Mysore, or any of these Hindu princely states, they managed to keep Hindu institutions and Hindu education systems alive significantly until 1947. Therefore, the belief that from 711 Common Era until 1947, there is a complete elimination of our education systems, political systems, and our, let's say, cultural systems, is something that cannot be supported by facts or history. The fact of the matter is, you must remember that at the time of the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, the predominant power in this country was the Maratha Empire. Yes. Okay, and that effectively translates to continuity of Hindu way of life and Hindu systems. Second, even after the Maratha, let's say, defeat in the Third Battle of Panipat against Ahmad Shah Abdali, you have to realize that there was a resurgence of the Maratha leaders, considering people like Mahatji Scindia. Okay, these are the people from Gwalior and Indore and other places who managed to ensure that they remained relevant in the political scene. So Bahadur Shah Zafar was the king of a city and of Shahjahanabad, of a very limited place. He was not ruling over even a sultanate, or he was not ruling over some kind of an empire. He was reduced to a puppet because effectively after Aurangzeb, The Mughal dynasty, so to speak, was only producing debauched drug addicts and nobody else. So there is no question of some predominant Muslim power in India in the 1700s. After him and the miserable battles that he lost over 27 years, where Deccan, Dakshin became the graveyard of the Mughal Empire. Okay, really, you were only looking at Hindu kings. So I believe that it is an incorrect statement, factually speaking and historically speaking, when you assume that there is a vast vacuum. No, there was no vacuum. Even under the British system, the fact of the matter is, even during those 200 years, you had your way of life significantly intact in quite a few places. How else do you think that? Yeah, please go on.
You continue.
Now, how else do you think that the Maharaja of Travancore was able to retain control over temples and he could perform his practices? And there was a vast network of temples and pathshalas across the country.
Are you hinting that most damage occurred after 1947, A, and B, that the temple ecosystem going out of the hands of Hindus is the greatest crime which ensured this perpetuation of this? Basically, the power went out of the Hindus to a government which is ruled by bureaucrats, which is ruled by a book, while other faiths continue to run their institution. Hindus don't control anything about
100%. The secularization of Hindu society is a consequence of investment after 1947, because even until 1947, despite close to about, let's say, from 1757 to 1947, and after the setting up of British institutions, if you have managed to produce people like Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, Rajagopalachari, Govind Vallabh Pant, H.V. Kamath, and all these people, it clearly shows that to a significant degree, despite having received English education, these people managed to retain their civilizational consciousness. The erosion of civilizational consciousness is a direct consequence of the third wave of colonization of this country, which is called the Nehruvian Marxist colonization of the Indic consciousness. So according to me, the erosion of the temple ecosystem, which includes its education ecosystem, its societal ecosystem, by the secular Indian state and its constant secularizing tendency, is the single biggest reason for producing multiple generations of self-loathing idiots. Otherwise, until 1947, people still had a certain degree of pride as far as their culture is concerned. Otherwise, you wouldn't have survived the Civil War of 1947.
It's a very beautiful point. If at all 80% of the population of this country is Hindus, of course, that is open to debate. But if at all it is.
Correct.
They don't have the civic might to take control of their own temples. Are you saying that? Or are you saying the government is all powerful and vested interest will never let temples go to the control of the Hindu masses?
See, the constant argument that is given is that the Hindus cannot manage their own temples, and therefore it needs the patronizing presence of the state to manage the temples. Now, I have to ask this question, then how is it that NRI Hindus are able to run temples in the United States, which is a predominantly Protestant Christian state, and they also have their own institutions? So it can't be a case that NRI Hindus are less corrupt and more honest than Indian Hindus. Try making that statement, and let's see if you survive the next election. Okay. Second, you can't make the argument that secularism in a Protestant country somehow gives more freedom to Hindus than secularism in a Hindu country with respect to their own, let's say, religious institutions. Three, the nature of the state, because of the multiple interests that it has to accommodate, is to significantly dilute tradition. And therefore, any community whose religious institutions are under the control of the state will always suffer a constant decline in tradition and therefore its cultural consciousness. And the only community to suffer that is the Hindu community in this country.
You mean Hindus will have nothing to fight less than a battle to get control of their own temples?
They have to not just fight a battle against the state, they also have to fight a battle against vested interests from across the board who will constantly raise the bogey of caste to prevent reversion of temples. Here's the interesting part. Every society that surrenders its right of self-defense exclusively to the state, as well as the management of its religious institutions to the state, will constantly find itself an orphan community without anybody to protect it. And the direct example is what has happened, and it will ultimately lead to what is happening to Bangladeshi Hindus as on date, and it will also lead to what is happening to Hindus in Bengal also, whether you're in a majority or a minority. If you do not have autonomy over your institutions, you are looking at a terminal decline of your position over 15-20 years or a maximum of 50 years, after which you'll have nothing but Hindus in name only or no Hindus.
A very interesting point on the same page, Sai Deepak says, most colonized societies did not realize that the entire worldview had changed. for they could not see beyond political independence. Very important statement. They could not see beyond political independence and aspired for freedom to govern themselves, albeit using the same values and institutions they had inherited from the European colonizer. In effect, you're saying that nothing changed except for that the white officer became the brown officer.
Correct, 100%.
Now, one parting comment, I mean, in our next show, we're going to discuss your references to Immanuel Kant, to a lot of other religion organizations run their own schools and colleges, and people from Indic communities have been at their mercy for admissions and the like, because temple ecosystem stopped running. This you say in the further pages. So that is going to be our discussion in the next series, or the fourth part of India, that is Bharat. One party comment on the temple ecosystem I want to know from you. See, we, at least since the past few years, we have a government that has professed that it has some kind of welfare of the Indic communities in mind, who they say were oppressed. Now that the temple freedom movement could not even gain traction in a government supposedly coming on the plank that their heart bleeds for the Indic communities, what does it hint to you?
It hints to me that no political party can be trusted to secure the interests of Hindus in entirety, especially with respect to control of our religious institutions, because the nature of politics, political interest, and the politician is to arrogate as much power as possible, and therefore there is expected to be a policy of continuity regardless of dispensations or regardless of parties or ideologies, at least as far as this particular issue is concerned, which is precisely why I have consciously taken the position that the fight for temple freedom is not a political fight, it's a civilizational fight against all political parties and against all political ideologies, because there's not a single party that has proven itself to be a better party with respect to temple freedom. Nobody has ceded space to Hindus on this particular front. So when people assume that this is some kind of a partisan political fight, no, it is not. If at all there are a few political voices that support this particular movement, they happen to be exceptions and not the rule. The rule across the board, across the political and so-called ideological divide, is to control institutions of the Hindu community alone.
Okay, that's a very interesting and a telling comment from J. Sai Deepak. As I am telling you again, this is the book, if you want to read more, India, that is Bharat by J. Sai Deepak. In part 4, as I said, we are going to discuss how, if autonomy is given to religions to run their own institutions, how it can have a far-reaching impact, because in many cases, temples, I mean, now in other cases, churches issue certificates that you belong to a certain a sect that you follow. There is certain allegiance because it involves running of hospitals, schools, and these all things the poor Indic community children cannot look up to from temples of their own religion, which impacts the religion itself. It's a very interesting observation by Sai Deepak. So Sai, thank you so much for sparing time and joining us on part 3 of India, that is Bharat. We're looking forward to a lot more in part 4 and 5. Thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.